This is Bill Brady recording another recording for the Kingship course. This is another recording specifically about Ecclesia. Most recent recording I did, I revealed to you how you can, from the outward appearance, look at a group of believers and tell whether they're functioning as a church in the sense of religion, or whether they're functioning as an ecclesia. I am reminded that in the time of Paul, it wouldn't have been church and ecclesia, it would have been synagogue and ecclesia. The old was the synagogue and the new was the ecclesia. And of course, there were some aspects of the synagogue that were perfectly fine. They weren't in contradiction to scripture, but there were some aspects that were wrong. In the letter to the Galatians, Paul is talking to believers in the Ecclesia in Galatia, ecclesias in Galatia, it's a region with several ecclesias, many, about the need to not buy into what the Judaizers were teaching about the need to be circumcised. Anyway, I'm also reminded that God speaks about not looking at the outward appearance, but looking at the heart. So what I taught you in the previous recording is looking at the outward appearance. Yes, you can tell which functions are old church functions that are not functions that the ecclesia are going to be doing. And you can tell which functions are ecclesia functions, but you cannot tell from the outward appearance whether there's a lampstand there or not. I'm going to give a testimony now. Many, many years, decades ago, I was assistant pastor in a church plant, a church that was being planted. The senior pastor had talked a denomination into allowing him to plant a church. Now, he was charismatic, and the denomination had charismatics in it, but it was not a charismatic denomination. And the local church in the area that was maybe 20, 30 miles away that was sponsoring this church plant was not charismatic in its leadership, and may have had some charismatics in the congregation, but it was not charismatic in its leadership. So the new church plant ended up with a church board that was made up entirely of non-charismatic businessmen. The senior pastor recruited me to join as an assistant pastor. He was training me. And at the time, I saw him as an evangelist and a pastor. Today, I would see him as being one who was an apostle, who was called as a preacher, evangelist, and a prophet. At the time, he did function prophetically. And however, every message he ever gave from the pulpit always ended with an altar call. He could take any place in scripture and begin talking about it and end up giving an altar call, which frustrated me no end as a teacher because I would have been doing something different with that passage. But I had a lot to learn from him, and he could see. I remember one day he was casting demons out of a person I was participating, and I was praying with my eyes open as this was going on, and he cast 3 demons out, and he watched my eyes go like this, watching these demons go out, and he said, "Did you see it?" "No, I didn't." But my spirit obviously could, but I didn't have eyes to see the demons. I didn't function in discerning of spirits as he did. Anyway, point being, this congregation, this church plant, went through 2 church boards that we fired because they were in disagreement with us because they were non-charismatics. And the 3rd church board fired the pastor, and then I resigned. And then the Lord gave me a prophecy. And in the prophecy, I can't remember all the details about it, but I was reminded about this yesterday, that the prophecy spoke about no more miracles, which was interesting, but also said that their lampstand was going to be removed because of their firing the pastor. And that church ceased to exist within a year. But it immediately ceased to be an ecclesia. And this is very interesting to me that it actually had been an ecclesia. There had been two apostles present. I had received my calling as an apostle while I was there. And I'm now realizing that the senior pastor also had an apostle calling on his life. So there were two pastors there. He was functioning in some of the 9 manifestations of the Spirit. I was just beginning to function in prophecy at that time. And I was just beginning to learn about charismatic things and also just beginning to read about the prophetic movement and started reading about prophets. But anyway, my point is this church plant that to the outward appearance had no indication that it was an ecclesia and that it had a lampstand, did have a lampstand, and it was an ecclesia, even though it had a church board, was collecting tithes and offerings, had somebody running it who was calling himself a pastor, but he actually was an evangelist, prophet, apostle, and was connected to a denomination. It was still an ecclesia. I didn't know it at the time. And it wasn't until just yesterday I realized, oh, that church plant that I was assistant pastor in was an ecclesia up until the time that its lampstand was removed when it fired its senior pastor, and I left also. Very interesting. So the scripture says, with respect to people, that God does not look on the outer appearance, but he looks at the heart. This was respect to God speaking to Samuel about David being the next king of Israel. Remember, Samuel called in all of David's older brothers one at a time, probably from older to next oldest to next oldest to next oldest. And he finally, having gone through all of them and realizing that God wasn't choosing any of them as a king, even though God had sent him to David's father's house, Jesse's house, to anoint a king, Samuel says, do you have any more sons in the household? Well, yeah, there's David. He's the youngest. He's out with the sheep. Well, call him in. And then Samuel, who is seeing and hearing from God, recognizes that David is the one that's called to be king. So the same thing applies with respect to groups of believers who could either be a church or an ecclesia. It can actually be an ecclesia without you realizing that it's an ecclesia. That newly planted church, it was a year or two old at the time that I was functioning in it, the time that it ended, and the time that I left, the senior pastor was fired and I left, was an ecclesia. Though to all outward appearances, you would think not, but it actually did have a lampstand. So this testimony gives you the lesson that I learned yesterday, to not just look at the outward appearances of a group of believers. You can do that, and you can tell which practices they are functioning in are church functions and which practices they are functioning in are ecclesia functions. But to determine whether, when it's down here around the edge of the transition from church to ecclesia, to determine whether it actually has become an ecclesia or not, you need to be able to either see the presence of the lampstand or hear that it's there. I heard that it was there and was being removed. I hear. Others see. I will at some point function in seeing to that level. I don't currently do that, and I didn't at that time. So I wasn't even aware about lampstands. I mean, it wasn't something that I had studied in scripture. I wasn't aware of churches and ecclesias at that time. I wasn't aware of any of that from scripture. But God spoke to me as one who had a calling as a prophet on my life. And that's not the kind of prophecy that someone who functions in the simple gift of prophecy gives. That's the kind of prophecy that a prophet gives. And I was very much a rookie at that time with respect to giving prophecy, but I was functioning as a prophet when I gave that prophecy. By the way, went to the senior pastor who had recently been fired, what to do with this prophecy. I wrote it out and was going to tape it on the door of the church. You know, realizing yesterday that was like Martin Luther putting the thesis on the door of the church of Wittenberg, right? But the pastor advised against it, and I didn't. That information was pretty much just for him and I, and not for the others, or at least the pastor felt that it wasn't wise to put it up there. I think he was probably trying to maintain his status in the denomination so that maybe he could do this again, or at least not have a bad reputation follow him elsewhere. So anyway, I was told not to put that prophecy out there publicly. But that information was for me. And 30, 40 years later or something, I finally realized, oh, that church plant that I was part of back in the 1989, 1990, somewhere in there, was actually a baby ecclesia. It had a lampstand. It didn't get very far before it had its lampstand taken away from it. But for a brief moment, it was an ecclesia. So from my testimony, you can learn about not just looking at the outer appearance of a church that might be an ecclesia, but also look at the heart of it, which means to see the lampstand or to hear whether there's a lampstand there or not.